Okay, so we're going to start with the following question, which is there a unique point of view that Judaism has to offer regarding sexuality? And as an outgrowth of that, should a curriculum at yeshiva differ from a secular curriculum when it comes to sex education? And I'm going to let...
Hi, do I need this, or am I okay with that? Okay, I need it. First of all, I'll just say it feels a little bit ridiculous to be speaking on a panel with Sheva Marcus moderating in the topic of sex ed. I kind of feel like we should switch places and listen to her on the subject. But it's probably too late for that. Ora and I met for a little while to sort of talk out our thoughts about the subject a few weeks ago. And in talking out our thoughts in response to this question, my first thought that I shared with Ora was, well, in theory, they shouldn't be so different. In a sex ed curriculum, whether it's a Jewish sex ed curriculum or not, should ideally foreground values of sexual relationships, whether it's loyalty, dignity, safety, honesty, self-awareness. These values should be common to any sex ed curriculum. I was very much influenced in this by a book that I really appreciate by a woman named Deborah Rothman. The book is called Talk to Me First. It's a great book for parents that are looking for a kind of go-to guide, how to talk to their kids about sex. At that point, I was actually feeling pretty good. I was pretty self-satisfied. This is going to be easy. And then Ora pointed out masturbation, homosexuality, premarital sex, a lot of areas where there are clear tensions between Jewish values, or halachot, and what you might expect to find in a non-Jewish sex ed class. And I kind of went, oh yeah, that's not the right answer. And it occurred to me that her very question kind of shifted my thinking. I think that if there's a value that needs to be foregrounded in a Jewish sex ed curriculum, it's the value of self-restraint. Self-restraint, obviously, in response to external halachic categories. Judaism does promote the value of self-restraint. I find some of the contexts within which Judaism promotes this value sometimes to be problematic and disturbing. But the notion that we don't have an indiscriminate set of menu options, that we kind of make whatever choices we want whenever we want, is a Jewish notion, particularly in the area of sex. What does that look like on the ground? The application of that, of self-restraint, is obviously really complicated and is kind of the most important question. But that value of self-restraint, teaching kids the value of self-restraint in the area of sex, I think is pretty central. I want to make one other point. I've been reading a book recently that I also think is a fantastic book by an American psychologist named Rollo May. It was a book called Love and Will. It's a more theoretical take on the subject. And he shares the idea in this book that as a society, we actually have not necessarily become healthier psychologically as a result of the relatively greater freedom we have in the area of sexual relationships. That yes, we now have much more freedom to choose to do whatever it is we want to do, but with that freedom has not necessarily come a sense of self-awareness and a sense of general comfort within our sexual relationships. So I think that's an important idea to consider, because we sometimes can tend to get a little bit apologetic about the idea of self-restraint in the area of sexuality in halakha, and I don't think we need to be. There's obviously more to consider there, but I think the effort to dismiss self-restraint as a value related to our sexual selves does not necessarily make us healthier, does not necessarily make us happier. The relationship between those is complicated, and we have to be careful that we don't unwittingly preach the virtue of self-punishment, but we don't have to be uncomfortable in our sex education preaching the virtue of self-restraint.
Thanks. So first of all, it's really such an honor to be here. So thank you. Thank you. I would totally agree with everything you said. I would like to add, I think an important point that was really pointed out to me by a mentor of mine, Ruth Fagan, for anybody who knows her. Her daughter's here. Hi, Danya. So she's my mentor at Heschel. And we were one time having a conversation after something that I taught about kind of saying, well, this is Judaism's values about sexuality. The details weren't necessarily important, but she pointed out to me something that I think is really true, that we as a community need to be really careful when we extrapolate values, like Jewish values, from the text that we have. At the end of the day, there's a tremendous amount of conjecture on our part when we draw out those values. And I think it's important, to remind myself to kind of take that out with a little bit of humility. And I think that when we say, Judaism says this about sex, there's a tremendous wealth of sources in Jewish. There's a tremendous amount of sources in Judaism about sex, and although sometimes we maybe want to only look at some of them because those are the ones that seem parallel, like you were saying, to the values that we have, there are a lot of sources that are very aesthetic in nature, and that kind of go against what maybe those of, I know for myself as somebody who believes in comprehensive sexuality education, they don't align so well. So I think it's just really important to acknowledge that and to just have a kind of a sense of a pause when making claims about what it means to have Jewish values about sex and sexuality. That said, there's a word that I think is incredibly important in Jewish literature that can't be left out of a conversation about Jewish values about sexuality, and that is kedusha. What exactly kedusha is, it's even hard to translate, sanctity, holiness, whatever that is a word that is really important to talk about when you talk about sexuality. The way I think about it is a degree of, to designate some things, an aspect of life that's designated by God, that through the actions of people can be sanctified and elevated beyond its kind of normal status. And I think that we have examples of this in many different areas. Shabbat is an example of one. The Beit HaMikdash is an example of another one. And I think that sexuality, is another example of that. And that, I think, is a strong voice in Jewish texts when we talk about sexuality, is that a lot of the halachot are designed to promote kedusha, which is essentially that sexuality, human sexuality, is an incredibly powerful aspect of the human experience. And it's something that's designated by God as having the potential to be kadosh, and that through human actions and human decision making, we can make sexuality kadosh. It's not necessarily going to be that way, but it's a partnership between God's designation and human beings. And I think that to me is a hugely central value in Judaism about sexuality. And then to answer the second half of the question, if a yeshiva, I don't teach at a yeshiva, but I teach at a Jewish day school, but I think that question is still kind of the same. If the curriculum in a Jewish day school should differ than a curriculum in a secular school or in a school without a religious affiliation. And I think both of our answers would be absolutely yes. The way I think about how that has to look is the same way that we have kind of a dual curriculum. That's part of maybe what's so challenging about being in a Jewish day school or sending your kids to a Jewish day school is it takes a lot more time. Part of what it means to have a dual curriculum is you're learning both secular and Judaic subjects to the fullest extent possible. So in that vein, part of the way I think about it is that sexuality education needs to be taught from a strictly secular perspective, in that we're teaching students all of the different kind of modes of contraception, even if some of those may run counter to a certain halachic psak, that we're talking to students about all types of sexual relationships that can exist, even if that runs counter to perhaps something written in the Torah. And I think that we're really exposing it's our responsibility as members, as our students being members of the secular world, to really teach them fully kind of unquote unquote biased perspective of sexuality, and then at the same time also have opportunity for them and in their Jewish selves to learn about Jewish values, Jewish laws pertaining to these to sexuality in a formal setting as well. And then, and this I think is also really important, to make sure that those two things are separate, but then also to encourage students independently and in informal settings to decide and encourage them through the other critical thinking skills that we're teaching them in high school to figure out how they want to choose to balance those two things, right? That should not, in my opinion, be done in a formal way for anyone to say, well, and this is how you make your decision and your balance, but by teaching kids both sides and encouraging them to be thoughtful and self-reflective, amazing, wonderful people that we know that they are, to help them in an informal setting kind of figure out the nexus between those two areas.
So the second question is going to be one of my personal favorite questions, which is, should sex education be co-ed? That is, should boys and girls be sitting together when you're having sex education? I know I have opinions about this, and I think each of you have kind of your own opinions about this. Are you going to start this one? Yeah. Okay.
Hello again. So we agree on this one, so nothing super exciting is going to happen between the two of us. But we agree. The sex ed class that I teach at Heschel is a 9th grade sex ed class. It happens second semester of 9th grade. And it actually is incredibly important to me that class takes place with the co-ed, both genders, all genders, everyone all together. That's really important to me for 2 reasons. One of them is practical, and one of them is a little bit more theoretical. The practical reason is at 9th grade, and probably even towards the end of high school, if we would separate by gender, I think the girls would have a really wonderful opportunity to learn and think and discuss and learn sex ed. I think that the boys it would be very challenging for me, at least, to instruct a classroom of just boys, just from purely a classroom management issue. And what's really interesting is that by having the classes together, it in a way civilizes the boys, in that it enables them to know that if they, make stupid jokes, they're going to look like totally sexually inexperienced, and then that is going to make them look bad, and then they don't want to. So it actually has this really lovely side benefit of creating actually really wonderful classroom management, and it actually enables everybody in the community to be able to learn in a way that I don't think would be really possible if it was separate. The second reason is a little bit more values-based. One of the goals that we have when we teach kids sexuality is that they should be able to then take what they learn and use it in their lives. And oftentimes what that means is, the way that's going to manifest, one of the major ways it manifests is engaging in conversations with their partner about issues that are arising in their relationship about sexuality. And for most of my students, those conversations are going to be happening with somebody of a different gender. And we need to model that comfort and that ability to be able to have those conversations with each other by normalizing that and by making sure that they all have shared language. They're all hearing the same messages, particularly about things like contraception. It's not just the girl's responsibility, right? It's not something that girls get focused on more if they're girls or boys. No, everyone's hearing the same thing. We're encouraging everyone to be able to have that level of comfort to be able to engage with each other and speak with each other about these issues. That said, I think there also is a really important place for certain types of sexuality education in separated gender environments. In my school in Heschel, the way that kind of looks is we have a component of the course that's Jewish values about sex and sexuality, and that happens separate. The reason why we do that is because, particularly in 9th grade, and I think you could probably make this case throughout later in high school as well, spiritually and psychologically, generally speaking, boys and girls are in very different places about these issues, and therefore need to be having different conversations. And in order to really have it be effective education and create an environment that fosters the religious, spiritual, psychological, and social growth to the best of our ability for our students, is we need to meet the girls where the girls are at, roughly wherever that falls, kind of in the average, and for the guys to be met where the guys are at, roughly where that falls.
Right, so no fireworks here in terms of the answers. I think there's room for separate sex moments in a sex education curriculum. I think that's a nod to where our students are developmentally. Fundamentally, I think sex education should happen in co-ed settings for largely the same reason. I think a lot of what we're trying to accomplish in sex education is training our students to talk about sex in a frank and honest and self-aware way. If they can't do that, then they probably will go out into the world and have less meaningful, bad sex. So that's not the goal, right? The goal is not to graduate cohorts of students who are going to have bad sex, right? So they need to practice these conversations with members of the opposite sex. And I think that one kind of moment that comes up a lot when I talk to kids about sex, they like to use the word chemistry. I don't know if you've ever heard that word in the context of sex. And they talk about it as if it's something that you just kind of naturally have or naturally don't have with a partner. And that's kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for somebody with whom you have chemistry. And I have to sort of talk out with students how couples can actually develop chemistry by talking to one another in an open and frank fashion, learning not only about their bodies, but learning about their partner's bodies, and learning about how those bodies fit together in the best possible ways. There's a certain amount of debunking that has to happen in order to get them to rehearse and practice those conversations, so that ultimately, when they're in one of those relationships, they can actually do it well. They can have those conversations at a later time in their life when the stakes are much, much higher.
I just have to. Can I add something really important, really fast? I know I talk a lot. I'm going to talk real fast. I just think it's really important to acknowledge that in the conversation that we're having about having separate gender or separate sex moments of education for our students, that we just have to acknowledge the challenge that that poses to LGBTQ students. When we spoke about it, I think we both were like, it's a challenge. At the same time, to not have those moments of separate gender education, I think would be a real disservice to the majority of the population of the students that we're dealing with. But we didn't want to pretend like it's not something we thought about in separating, and I don't think we have a perfect answer for anyone at the moment about that.
Or I just want to push you a tiny bit on that issue about when you talk about for more philosophical, religious space, and you separate the ages because boys and girls are in different places. Can you just spend a minute talking about what that looks like?
Sure. So it's I only talk to the girls. In that setting, one of the rabbis at the school speaks with the boys. I know that what he talks about with the boys is the importance of fostering a sensitivity to the other person who you're engaging in sexual behaviors with, and a recognition of the intrinsic power imbalance, and just kind of an acknowledgement of that, which I think is for ninth grade boys and for, I think, men in general, and for sure developing adolescent males is something that needs to kind of be acknowledged, and I think highlighting the way certain halachot support that, and I think that very much is a Jewish value. I think that pushing and the highlighting of that value, almost the self-restraint that you were speaking about, I think is a lot more of a challenging and real topic for the boys than it is for the girls. And with the girls, we talk about kind of different things. We talk about the importance of fostering self-esteem and self-respect, which I think for sure are issues that boys struggle with also, but I think are really at the forefront of the teenage girl experience. And I think those are two particular examples. I'm sure I could think of more of things that I mean when it's psychologically and spiritually, they're in different places.
Is high school too late? Is grade 9 too late? Should we be starting earlier? Some schools start in grade 4. I mean, I have 3 children. One's in 3rd grade. We've talked to her about sex. If I was in charge of an elementary school, I would encourage them to figure out a way to talk to their 3rd graders about sex too. Would it look extremely different than it does in 9th through 12th grade? I hope so, or I'd be doing a very clumsy job. But yes.
Yeah, I just want to say, I feel like I hate when the conversation always goes back to the schools. Sex education has to start at home, and it should start when the kids are 2 or 3 years old. So, people have heard me say that, but I feel like that the schools are in their best, I feel like, an adjunct to the family. Sometimes they stand in the place, but they shouldn't. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I agree totally with that point. I think part and parcel with that is one of the other goals that I have in teaching sexuality education is to work with parents and do community-based programs like at a synagogue or even at a school, but to kind of reach parents of children of all ages, because really, just to put a plug for a book that you gave me, what was it? Everything you never wanted your kids to know.
Everything you never wanted your kids to know about sex, but were afraid that they would ask.
Exactly, right? Humans are sexual beings from the second that they're born and probably before that. So to figure out also ways, not just that I know we're talking about Jewish day schools, but to figure out ways in our communal institutions to have there be parent education so that kids can kind of start being educated as sexual beings from when they're infants.
I guess I'm allowed to do it. I'm holding the microphone. I can offer a tangent. So before I came this morning, the last time I spoke at a JOFA conference, I told my wife, Ellen, I said, I spoke on a panel, actually with your son, about being a male feminist. And I was like, that was so great. I was such a hero at the JOFA conference. But I know today is not going to go that smoothly. Okay, so first and foremost, it's not that I think self-restraint is the only value to put forth. That's one thing I would say. The other is I want to just push back a little on your formulation that we tell high school students sex is great, sex is pleasurable, but you shouldn't be having it. So I actually would be careful to say sex is great, sex is pleasurable. The Torah says you shouldn't be having it yet. I think that's an important distinction, and I'm pretty careful about. Pam Scheiniger is telling me to stop. Pretty careful to kind of walk that line. I don't think necessarily walking that line solves the problem you're pointing to. I think the problem you're pointing to is much bigger than just teaching them the language of self-restraint. But I do think the language of self-restraint is still pretty powerful and pretty important. And I think that it should be possible to talk about self-restraint in the context of sexual identity and sexual relationships without it becoming self-punishing, without it becoming a kind of like locus of guilt.
Anything you guys want to do in closing? Otherwise, yes, you have something closing? Oh, Red Death. You have a vulva puppet. Yes, okay.
Everything you never wanted your kids to know about sex, but were afraid they'd ask. Okay, really great for parents or for educators of any age, because it talks about the development of sexuality in a human being from beginning to end. This is another one. This book was actually my first book about sex. I underwent a pretty normal. This is not the copy. This is a different copy. Just freak anybody out. So I went to a really Orthodox high school. Oh, it's What Your Mother Never Told You About Sex. I went to a really Orthodox high school. I never had any formal sexuality education at all. And then I got married. And then, so this was actually a huge help. It's a really gentle, really clear, wonderful way of kind of opening up one's worldview about sex and sexuality. And this was probably the most impactful book that I've read in the last, since it came out. It's called Girls and Sex. I teach high school. In addition to being the sexuality education teacher, I run Women's Minyan, which is a daily kind of tefillah group for girls in 11th and 12th grade. And just the experience of sending those girls off to college and having them come back and talk to me about what the experience of what it's like to be really also in high school, but really on a college campus as a young woman navigating sex and sexuality was really frightening. And I read it, and it made it even more frightening. But if anybody is planning on either going to a college campus or has a child who is going to or is already on a college campus, or is really anybody who's interested in the topic at all, or a teacher, you have to read this because I think it really gives us the nudge to really do more for our girls than what we're doing now.
Okay, so here are my 3 favorite books on the subject. I said 2 of them. Love and Will by Rollo May is a much more like theoretical book, if anybody's interested in that kind of thing. Talk to Me First by Deborah Rothman is the most useful book that I read for parents. Just very practical, very grounded book. Teaching parents how to talk to their kids. This book's a little different. I really like it, though. It's called Guyland. It's really about the intersection of gender, feminism, and sexuality. If there's a, I guess, final point for me, it's great that sex education is starting to happen in schools, particularly in Orthodox schools, where I think we're usually a few years behind everyone else on this subject. Having said that, I think to some extent, if there's a lesson of 20th century psychology, it's that we're all a little bit haunted by sex. And it's kind of amazing to me, even when I think back on my own life, if I just had that one person, between the ages of whatever it is, 7 and 17, if one person had just given me that one sentence once during that decade, it would have made a tremendous amount of difference and stayed with me for a long time. And we're happy to try to be that person in the classes we teach, but really everyone can be that person for their children or for the children that they teach, and it can make, I think, a very powerful difference in experiencing sexuality in a healthy and positive and self-assured way.
Thank you. Thank you both.
אתה בראתה, אתה יצרתה, אתה נפחת בי, ואתה משמרה בקרבי.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to JEM, To Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.